Welcome to Future Hindsight, a podcast that takes big ideas about civic life and democracy and turns them into action items for you and me. I'm Mila Atmos. It's 2024, and the future of America is in your hands. Democracy is not a spectator sport, so we're here to bring you an independent perspective about the election this year and empower you to change the status quo. In a year where all we hear about is the presidential race, it's important that we keep sight of state politics. After all, American democracy resides in the states. And that means that the citizen changemakers who serve in the state legislatures are the people who truly endeavor to make government work for us everyday folk. They are on the forefront in the battle for our democracy by making sure that government delivers. Our guest today is Jessica Gonzalez Rojas. She's the New York State Assembly member representing the 34th District in New York City, which encompasses the neighborhoods of Corona, East Elmhurst, Jackson Heights, and Woodside. She joined us back in 2021, and we're so excited to have her back on the show. Welcome back, Jessica. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mila, for having me.
So you've been an Assembly member for 4 years now, and when we last spoke, that was 3 years ago. How has it been? How is it different from 3 years ago?
Wow, it's been 3 years. It's been a journey, quite honestly. Coming in as a new member, as an activist member, as someone who's disrupted the status quo, we came in with a really brand new class that was mostly insurgents that took out longtime incumbents. And we were the largest class in decades. And it was really profound to come in during COVID and try to navigate a system that is opaque, quite honestly, with the values and the vision that many of us held. However, over the years, I've been able to build coalitions, work with people even across the aisle on certain issues, work closely with advocates and grassroots leaders to really create the space to allow the voices of people most impacted by the policies that we pass to be really centered in the conversation. So it's been quite a journey. We've gotten a lot done, but there's a lot more to do as we continue to see the ways in which housing has impacted New Yorkers, healthcare access, our newest New Yorkers, dealing with the migrant crisis here, and ensuring that we're creating a state that is accessible, livable, affordable, safe for all people. So it's been quite a journey. I've learned a lot, and I've been very proud of my accomplishments thus far.
Yeah, that's terrific. You just mentioned all the things that affect our daily lives, housing, for example, and I think what a lot of people know but don't really know, I feel like people have a sense but don't fully understand how the state legislature actually affects their daily lives, and how the state legislature is the place where these decisions are made, where laws are decided that affect you on a daily basis in a way that federal laws don't. Mm-hmm. So for the benefit of the listener, give us a little bit of a primer on how state government works. I mean, one of the things you mentioned just now is that you're working across the aisle.
Yes. So the federal government creates large-scale laws and policies. The states can go further in protecting communities, investing in some of the policies that the federal government has created. Housing is a good example. There's programs like NYCHA, which is the New York Housing Authority, which is for low-income family members. And a lot of that money comes from the federal government. But as someone who represents the Woodside houses, which is a NYCHA development, we were able to advocate and pass and include in the budget funding to help with operating costs, with capital needs, because a lot of that housing was crumbling due to some of the inefficiencies of the federal government right now. And it was an opportunity for the state to step up. So while there's a lot of different levels of government, there's the city level, there's then the state level, and then the federal level, the state has a lot of power to govern a lot of the issues that actually impact both the federal and the city. So for example, we just passed a bill that would allow New York City to create pilot programs to look at ways in which we could legalize and upgrade basement apartments to ensure that they're safe. That is a state law, an action of the state, to allow the city to do that. So there's an interplay between federal government, with the example of NYCHA, and city government, where the state has a really pivotal role in passing policies that impact both and investing in some of those solutions. So the pilot program, for example, is something where we designated certain community districts to allow the city to explore ways to make these cellar and basement apartments safe for the residents. Right now, they're illegal. In a housing crisis, we have so many people living in basement apartments because it's cheap, or cheaper at least, and some of these homeowners need the extra funding, extra income by renting out their basements. But tragically, in Hurricane Ida, we saw people in my district get completely flooded out, in my neighborhoods die tragically from drowning in their own homes. So we pushed a law that allows the city to make these upgrades in certain districts, and that's an act of the state. And I was able to push for that. Another issue that I worked on that was across the aisle was universal school meals. In New York City, every child gets a free breakfast and free lunch. Across the state, that's not the case. Mm-hmm. And we put forward a bill with Senator Michelle Hinchy, who's the chair of the Agricultural Committee in the Senate. And we built a coalition of food justice advocates, parents, the teachers union, and we had over 100 people on the bill out of a body of 150. Mm-hmm. 26 were Republicans. So this was something that knew no partisan lines, and again, took a program that's federal, right? There's the federal nutrition program, to supplement it and invest in it so that we fill the gap in order to ensure that every child has a free breakfast and free lunch. Now, we didn't get that fully over the finish line. Last year, we got a historic investment of $135 million. We have 86% of all New York children covered. It's not 100%. So we're going to keep fighting for policies like that. That is a bipartisan issue in the state.
Yeah, thank you for speaking up about food insecurity. Now, what you're saying is that the bill really only covers New York City, but not the rest of the state. Is that correct?
No, the New York City currently, because we're considered Title I school district, we currently, like my son here in Queens, gets a free breakfast and free lunch. But in New York State writ large, in Buffalo or in different parts of Long Island, they didn't have universal meals unless they were considered a Title I school through the federal government.
Got it.
But we pushed to get the investment to fill that gap.
And so that was passed in this past budget?
It was passed in the last budget. We got up to 86% of kids, and now we were trying to get that 14%. We got increased funding, but we believe it's probably going to address the inflation and other increased costs. But we're going to just keep fighting till we get 100% of kids in New York covered. So it's not just the New York City kids that benefit because they've always benefited from universal school meals. It's every child in New York deserves a fresh meal, a free meal in their schools.
Yeah, of course. So is that part of the Hunger Prevention and Nutrition Assistance Program? Or is that a different program?
It's a different program.
Right.
Yeah.
So I noticed that about $57 million in this last budget that just passed are allotted for the Hunger Prevention and Nutrition Assistance Program. Yeah. And it sounds honestly like a tiny number. But how does this program work, and how does it accomplish its mission?
Yeah. So there's a number of food security programs that we have been advocating for. The one you mentioned, we call it HIPNAP, which is, we speak in acronyms oftentimes, so thank you for sharing the whole name. One program I really was fighting for was the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which is SNAP. Again, a federal program, but the federal guidelines say the minimum monthly benefit for somebody could be as low as $23. And $23 for the month could barely feed a person one meal for the month. And we pushed to increase that minimum benefit to $100 a month. And I worked with Senator Rachel May on that. And we even took reporters food shopping with us to say, what can we get for $23 a month? We got 4 items. We got cereal, blueberries, a gallon of milk, and eggs. And it was $23.45. So we even went over the 23 minimum. So food security is so important, particularly in a district like mine that was the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic. And knowing how much things cost nowadays, that $23 could not get a family through a month of food. So that was an issue we fought for really, really closely, and it's connected to some of the other food justice programs. But it's really a patchwork of programs that exist. But SNAP is one of the most effective programs to ensure that families are given the tools to buy the food that's culturally appropriate through like an EBT card and go out and go food shopping. And it's a much more dignified program. But there's also programs like Nourish New York that make sure New York farm foods get to people who are in need. HipNap that really supports our food pantries. There's just quite a number of programs. And it's very confusing, unfortunately, but there are different mechanisms to address food insecurity. But all that takes investment, and that investment fight is in our state budget, which was due April 1st. Went 20 days late, but we got it done April 20th.
Yeah, congratulations
Thank
on
you.
getting it done. I mean, it was late, like you said. And it came in at $237 billion.
Yes.
What are your main takeaways for what New Yorkers should expect this coming year? Because if you think about the budget as a moral document, how would you describe the state's priorities?
I often say that the budget is a moral document and should reflect our values. It is a dance, though, and it is a dance between the New York State Assembly, the New York State Senate, and the governor. And quite honestly, the governor has the most powerful positioning in the process because the governor essentially puts out a budget that we have to vote for. And the negotiation is from when she releases her proposal in early January, and all the negotiations go through April. Last year was over a month late. This year is 20 days late. So there's a pattern here. But it is a really difficult process where every member is fighting for their priorities and pushing for the things that they care about the most and might impact their districts the most. For me, I was really looking at food insecurity issues and addressing food insecurity. I was looking at health issues and trying to beef up support and programs that expand access to health care, whether it's reproductive health care or general health care or children's health care, and I have a victory there. And housing was probably the most consequential outcome out of this budget. We have a housing crisis in New York, and we recognize that something had to be done this year. We tried last year. A deal fell apart. It was just excluded from the budget. This year, we wanted to ensure that we were building more housing, that the labor was union, and the housing was affordable, and that we were protecting tenants, but also supporting our homeowners. So that was a very difficult fight with many vast interests across the state because I represent Queens. We have certain needs in Queens. I represent a district that is nearly 70% of renters, tenants. And so my strongest interests are for our tenants, and then my homeowners are small homeowners, right? Make sure we're supporting them as well. But, there's a vast set of interests across the state. So it was a very difficult negotiation, but I think we were able to get to a plan that, many of us on the left in particular didn't love, but it moves us towards the goals of tenant protections, more housing, and union housing. So that is probably going to be the most consequential outcome from the budget. But I was also able to get something I just celebrated in May that we looked at and fought for some of the COVID-era protections that we got through the federal government. There was a state of emergency when COVID happened, and they actually put forward some really good and exciting public health policies that ended up ending many months back. And then people were impacted by rolling off these good things. So one example was continual enrollment for children who are on Medicaid and the state children's health insurance program. Basically, a parent didn't have to re-enroll or recertify, re-enroll every single year to prove that they were eligible for these programs. And when the federal government lifted that requirement to just keep them automatically enrolled, children had health care. And New York State covers our children despite immigration status, despite income. So we have a really high rate of children who are insured. And as a mom, I know I need to get my son vaccinated and get regular screenings and all that. And this program that was a federal emergency program that allowed children to continue for a number of years without having to re-enroll was really successful. However, the program ended, and nearly 400,000 children in New York fell off the rolls, lost their health care. that was tragic. So one of the bills I put in and ended up getting passed in the budget was a bill that requires children who are Medicaid and the state children's health and program to be continually enrolled from infancy, from 0 to 6 years old. So I'm really excited that we got that in the budget. It's going to be such a relief, lifts a burden for families, particularly immigrant families that may not be able to navigate some of the paperwork and the language needs, and then helps the hospitals, right? Many who are safety net hospitals serving people without health insurance, serving kids without health insurance, and then bearing that burden and that cost, it makes sure that they get reimbursed for that care. So that was a big victory that's health-related and something I fought for.
Yeah, congratulations. I love that you did that. That is indeed very, very impactful. Like you said, re-enrolling year to year, it's such a burden, and it's cumbersome, and it's complicated, and it really is hard for many families to make sure that this is done on a regular basis. And there's so many stories nationwide where people fall off because even if they did fill out the paperwork, but it gets lost and all of these nightmare stories, it should just be automatic. After all, once you're in the system once, they know how old you are.
Exactly.
They know who you are.
They know who
this
you
is
are.
Not a secret.
Oh, and it actually saves the state money in administrative costs, right? Because
That's
there's a cost in administering and having the staffing and the needs to continue to check people's enrollment. So it's a win-win-win all around, and I was really thrilled to get this done. But it really came out of a tragic situation, right? The COVID pandemic. But out of that came some promising policies that we've been trying to extend. Even with the SNAP benefits, there was an increase in SNAP benefits that also ended with the public health emergency ending. And we were trying to get that back and increase that minimum benefit. So a lot more to do, but it's certainly, in terms of healthcare, we really had some wins as well.
So I have a question about housing, because you talked about that just now, and the budget, and there's a lot of talk about good cause eviction in the news, but I think it's really poorly understood. And housing is so important in New York, and as it is elsewhere, frankly, all over the country. I'm curious about what you think about what the repercussions are of this new law. And honestly, it's so confusing to me. I don't understand fully how it is different from what it was before. And what do you think is the impact for your constituents?
So the reality is that the good cause eviction bill did not get in the budget in its fullest form. So what the bill does is identify what are the conditions by which a homeowner can evict a resident. And it very clearly outlined that, whether it was non-payment of rent or being a nuisance or illegal activity or any sort of disruption to the household, or if the landlord needed the home for their family. So it outlines those requirements, right? This is basically the code of conduct of a good tenant. But it also required that a landlord or homeowner that's renting to a tenant must continue their rental agreement, and it could only be increased by 1.5% over each year. So it gave caps on how much you can increase the rent. There were areas that were, if certain costs came up, there was some wiggle room. But that's the bill. The bill did not make it in the budget under its fullest form. The opportunities to increase rent are higher. There's all these rules about if the homeowner wants to make upgrades, there's a certain amount of cost that they could kind of pass on to the tenant in different ways, but it did outline what are the reasons for eviction. That is clear. And that's important because the tenant is aware and clear and the landlord is aware and clear. But some of the protections of ensuring that rent increases didn't go so high were not really included in the bill, and a lot of tenant advocates actually opposed the final version that ended up in the budget. So it was definitely a compromise. We really pushed for more tenant protections. We really pushed to decrease the percentage of increase in rent over years. But it does require landlords to continue a lease a year after year unless they violate the terms of tenancy, which are the ones I mentioned earlier. So it is a little confusing, very specific. There's lots of little details in that, but we got basically part of good cause, but not the entirety of the bill in the budget. But I do believe it did expand protections for tenants, and we're going to continue to push and improve it as the years go on.
Yeah. Oh, that's good news that it's just a step in the right direction.
It's a step in the right direction. It's a step in the, and again, a hard fight. We had tenant advocates up in Albany daily. But I think, with any budget, there's compromise in that. And we were able to take a step forward and then hopefully continue to fight another day.
We're taking a short break to hear from a podcast we think you'll enjoy called What the Health. And we'll be back with Jessica Gonzalez Rojas in just a moment.
If you're enjoying the show, here's another podcast you'll like, What the Health. I'm Julie Rovner, host of the show and chief Washington correspondent at KFF Health News. Every week, top reporters from outlets including the New York Times, Politico, and CNN join me to discuss the latest health and health policy news. Confused by all the health policy jargon? We'll break it down in terms that are easy to understand. What the Health from KFF Health News. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
And now, let's return to my conversation with Jessica Gonzalez Rojas. Let's circle back on the basement legalization bill. And it passed in the budget, but only included 15 out of 59 districts in New York City.
Yes.
And you just introduced a bill alongside State Senator Julia Salazar to expand to other areas. And you mentioned why. But tell us more about what happened, about what did pass, and what you hope will change with your proposed bill.
Again, the initial bill that was introduced by Assemblymember Harvey Epstein, who was a good friend and colleague, would allow the city of New York to create a program to upgrade apartments, to allow basement and cellar apartments to be upgraded and provide a grant program for landlords and homeowners to do that. Again, we want these potential housing or actual housing for many tenants that already live in basements, but we wanted this potentiality to be safe, have the means of egress necessary for families to escape a fire or a flood, and provide dignified housing. So that was the goal of the bill. It went from sort of a citywide expansion for this program, for the city to be empowered to do that, because the state had power at this moment. And what ended up in the budget, this is the compromise point, is a pilot program that named 15 specific community districts.
So now it's a pilot program as opposed to a statewide program that's been approved.
Yes.
Thank you for clarifying.
It's a pilot program for New York City only in 15 districts that would give the city the authority. And they actually have to pass a bill on their own as well to approve it on their level, but we give them the authority to do so. And in Queens, in my neighborhood, and again, my neighborhood was hit really hard by Ida. I mean, the day after Ida hit, I toured the district and just saw great sadness, destruction of property. Again, some of the neighborhoods that was hit in my district had people whose lives were lost. Again, a baby died. I mean, it's just incredibly tragic, and I saw a lot of this with my own eyes. Many of those community districts were excluded from the pilot. So it made no sense. The places that need it the most should be part of this pilot program. It only included in Queens Community District 2, which is like Woodside, Sunnyside, maybe a little bit of Elmhurst. But East Elmhurst wasn't included. Jackson Heights wasn't included. Astoria wasn't included. Corona wasn't included. And again, those are all areas that have working class families, immigrant families, who are living in basements illegally. And we wanted to include those in the pilot program. Again, the pilot program in itself was a compromise, but then the fact that only one community district in Queens and Western Queens was included was what made no sense. It really was inexplicable. And folks have asked me, well, how did that be decided upon? It was not the legislature. This is again part of that dance of negotiation with the state assembly, state senate, and the governor. So somewhere along the way, they said these 15 districts and named them. So Senator Salazar represents Brooklyn, and a lot of her districts that are most impacted were excluded as well. So we are introducing a bill that would include Community District 1, 3, and 4, which are the neighborhoods of Astoria, Jackson Heights, East Elmhurst, Corona, parts of Woodside, and District 5 in Brooklyn, which is the East New York area, to ensure that those will be included. So it's going to be a fight, right? Because a lot of people might say, well, we did it in the budget. No, we didn't. We weren't able to get some of the most impacted neighborhoods included. So we hope to get that done in the next several weeks as the session is wrapping up in early June.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad that you're doing this work. It sounds really impactful, especially for the families who are living in illegal housing in basements right now. I want to pivot here a little bit. This conversation would not be complete without also having a conversation about reproductive freedom and equity. Mm-hmm. So in a time when all states are busy passing laws around abortion, whether to outlaw it or to make it legal, New York Democrats want to include an equal rights amendment on the ballot in November, which was just declared null and void by New York's Supreme Court Justice Daniel Doyle, and he ordered for the amendment to stay off the ballot. And I know people think that it's actually going to still be on the ballot anyway after an appeals process. And of course, in 2019 in New York, the state legislature passed the Reproductive Health Act, which made abortion legal. But given we already have reproductive health freedom, tell us about what's the purpose actually of this amendment, or what are the other things that we still need that are maybe not obvious to everyday people?
Yeah, in 2019, what we did is take abortion out of the penal code. So abortion has long been legal in New York, but it still sat in the penal code of our laws and statute. This is why who gets elected matters, because prior to being an elected official, I was an advocate and an executive director of a reproductive justice organization. For years, I would go to Albany fighting for the Reproductive Health Act. The Reproductive Health Act would take abortion out of penal code and put it in public health code, which, again, treats abortion as health care, which it is. And year after year after year, we'd advocate for it. But we had a Republican Senate. We had a very divided House. And it was a whole group of Democrats that were caucusing with Republicans that were holding a lot of progressive issues up. And in 2018, after Trump was elected, there was a wave of women who were running for office. And they were, powerful, and people were really galvanized by seeing what happened with Trump. And we had all these incredible women who ran and won and took out these Democrats that were caucusing with Republicans, and essentially Republicans in disguise. And these bold women were able to get in office. Now, how that's impactful? Years and years and years advocating for Reproductive Health Act. The year that these women started their job in 2019, within days, that bill was passed and signed into law. And that never happens. Things take a very long time in Albany. So to see that, the investment in a vote, getting good people in office can make this change so immediately was really powerful. And actually part of the push that got me to run, because people were like, we need more women in office who are amazing, and I'm going to push for reproductive freedom and health access and housing and families and education. So 2019, we passed the Reproductive Health Act, which took abortion out of penal code, put it in public health code. We've since passed a whole suite of bills that protect abortion providers, protects abortion, expands access to contraception. And we wanted to enshrine protection of a whole category of people based on age, race, ethnic origin, sex, and sex includes gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, and pregnancy outcome. That's the Equal Rights Amendment. It had to be passed in 2 consecutive sessions, and it would go to the voters. So it's going to go to the voters in November, and that would enshrine it into our Constitution. So it's not just law in New York. It would now be in our Constitution. As you mentioned, there was a court case led by a Republican actually in the Assembly in a very conservative district with a very conservative judge. So they ruled it unconstitutional and said it's going to not be on the ballot. Of course, it's going to be appealed. We're going to fight. I think our coalition of activists and gender justice leaders and those of us who are fighting for this issue feel pretty confident it will still remain on the ballot, but have this long legal process, which is frustrating. But if all goes well, it'll remain on the ballot, and voters will vote in November whether we enshrine these protections in our state constitution. So not just our statutes, not just our laws, in the Constitution. So it makes a really fundamental right for all New Yorkers and protection for all New Yorkers, which is really powerful.
Right. So thank you for explaining what the Equal Rights Amendment should do, which is amend the New York State Constitution. So, but you also have a reproductive freedom bill that you were able to pass in the budget. Tell us more about that.
Yes, it's really exciting. So it's called the Reproductive Freedom and Equity Fund Act. It was a bill I introduced at the wake of the leak from the Supreme Court prior to the official decision that overturned Roe v. Wade. And when that leak happened, we sort of knew that we were going to be in trouble with the Supreme Court given the way they stacked the judges, that they're right-leaning, many were Trump appointments. And we were very concerned about the outcome and had this bill ready to go. What it would do is three things. It would provide funding for capacity building for providers, right? Whether it was hiring more staff or upgrading technology and equipment, addressing capacity needs in the clinics. One, it would provide capacity support for providers and clinics, whether it's hiring nurses, whether it is upgrading technology or addressing some of the capacity needs given the increase of patients. Two, it would provide funding for uncompensated care or people who are underinsured and don't have access to abortion care. And three, the original form of the bill provided grants to nonprofits that assist patients in having access to care. So everything from travel to lodging to childcare to an interpreter to an abortion doula. A lot of these nonprofits are abortion funds that raise money to help patients get access to care. And we think of New York and New York City as shouldn't be a place that it'd be difficult to find an abortion provider. But when you look across the state, there's many abortion deserts. So many people who live in rural communities might have to travel, many, many miles to get to a provider. And we want to provide assistance for those that it might be a financial burden to do so. Now, again, compromise in the budget. We were able to get the bill in the budget. However, it removed the practical support, which was the third thing I mentioned, that we can't use the funds, unfortunately, for travel, for lodging, or, childcare. But we can provide coverage of the cost of the procedure for people who can't afford it. So it still really, really helps people that fall in that gap of being uninsured or underinsured and need access to reproductive health care in New York, but it won't help with the travel costs. So again, a compromise. I really wish we were able to continue to include the practical support because often that in itself is a barrier to care. But we hope that providing the funding for the abortion itself would free up some of these nonprofits to be able to focus on doing independent fundraising for these other elements that were removed. We were able to fund it at $25 million, which is exciting. And again, now it's a line item in our budget. So every year we're going to have to advocate for increasing its funding and watching and monitoring the program as it goes. Again, New York has really stepped up as a beacon of care for people across the country, people in New York who need the care. But we have to put our money behind our policies and our vision. And this is one way in which we did that.
Right. Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's good to have a line item.
It
because,
is.
like you
It's
said,
great.
after that, every year you have to look at it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So we have covered a lot of ground here. We talked about housing. We talked about reproductive freedom. We talked about food insecurity. Mm-hmm. And you are running for re-election.
Yes.
So when you talk to your constituents now, what are the things that you want to make sure they know about the things that you have delivered as an assembly member and the state lead for your communities? And what are you focusing on still trying to get done into the future?
Just the three things you mentioned are the issues that impact my district the most. Food insecurity is rampant before the pandemic, but the pandemic really shined a light on the crisis that was happening. I volunteered at a food pantry for many, many months during the pandemic, in the height of the pandemic, and just seeing those lines, mostly seniors, mostly immigrants, some children. It was heartbreaking. It allowed me to really see and hear and talk to people who were in need. And many of them had jobs, but their jobs were paid so little that they still had to wait on food pantry lines to feed their families. Housing. My team in my district office, that is the number one issue that they hear about and concerns, complaints, whether it's a bad landlord, ignoring the upgrade needs. We hear rats in apartments and peeling paint and leaky roofs. It's awful. Or it's simply I'm being evicted and I can't find affordable housing. I want our New Yorkers to stay in New York, and particularly my district, I want my neighbors to stay in Jackson Heights and East Elmhurst and Corona and Woodside and Astoria. It breaks my heart to hear that people feel like they can't afford to live here anymore after some of them have lived here for generations. So that's a huge, huge issue. And healthcare. Healthcare has been my long fight as both an activist, as an executive director, and now as a legislator. I'm really honing in on ways in which we can continue to expand healthcare. Our big goal is to pass the New York Health Act, which would provide universal single-payer healthcare for everyone. But that's certainly a far-reaching goal that we will continue to advocate for. But passing things like the continual enrollment for children 0 to 6, the Reproductive Freedom and Equity Fund. I'm fighting for another bill called Coverage for All, which did not make the budget, but we're hoping to also get it passed, that would expand the New York State Essential Health Plan to allow for undocumented people to enroll. And it actually requires us to submit a waiver from the federal government to draw down federal dollars, so it won't even cost the state money. It'll save us money, because right now many immigrants only rely on emergency Medicaid when things are so dire. So we're spending a lot of money there. I'd rather spend it in preventative care to ensure people are healthy and not to the edge of an emergency room when, a flu hasn't been cared for. So healthcare has been a top issue. But I want my constituents to know that I'm listening, that I am acting, and I bring their stories and their solutions to the state capitol in Albany.
I have a question about the undocumented population in New York getting access to health care through federal dollars. How does that work? Because for many people, this is a big sticking point. And I know that that's not a sticking point for you as a moral issue, but how does it work? And why is that good for New Yorkers writ large?
I'll start with that. So if COVID taught us anything, it taught us that the health of you and me and our neighbors and every person in our community is inextricably linked. So it is good public health policy to ensure everyone has access to health care, health insurance, and quality care. Right now, undocumented immigrants who live in this state and country contribute, right? They're paying sales tax. Their families are being raised here. Many of them are working, sometimes being exploited, working under the table, but they're contributing, right? These are our neighbors, our loved ones. We don't know anyone's status, right? But they're denied access to the New York State Essential Plan because of their immigration status. The New York State Essential Plan is a product of the Affordable Care Act that Obama passed, Obamacare. And what's exciting is that under Biden, we saw Washington State and Colorado submit a federal waiver that allows us to draw down federal dollars to create sort of a pass-through account that would allow us to use that money for undocumented communities. Because the ACA excluded undocumented immigrants from the federal policy, but if we submit this waiver, we can use some money to cover that population. This is important because, again, preventative care is what makes communities healthy. We shouldn't have to have people go to extremes where they're neglecting their health, neglecting chronic conditions, and ending up in the emergency room. Because anyone who ends up in an emergency room has to get cared for. But it costs the state dollars and it costs the federal government dollars that, again, could be saved by providing preventative care. So it's smart health policy, it's actually smart economic policy, and it contributes to the health and well-being of full communities like ours. So I have been fighting so hard for this. So I was so proud to carry the bill after Assemblymember Dick Gottfried retired, who used to carry the bill, and I put all my heart and soul in it. It's just very difficult in an environment that's very anti-immigrant to push for this. But I think we have a broad coalition of unions, of business leaders, of health advocacy groups, of immigrant rights groups that are fighting alongside me in this struggle to expand the New York State Essential Plan. Again, it's just good policy and the right thing to do for New Yorkers.
Mm-hmm. It's clear you really, really care.
Yeah.
You are really passionate about helping the everyday person.
Mm-hmm.
And we here at Future Hindsight believe that everyday people should also get involved. So what are 2 things an everyday citizen can do to get engaged in any of the issues that you just mentioned that need help, a coalition of you, the assembly member, and the constituent to make sure that these things get passed?
I think it's important to know that you are the boss of your elected official. I am accountable to 135,000 people in my district, whether they voted for me or not, whether they can vote or not. I'm still accountable to them. And I think for everyday New Yorkers, it's critical to know who you are the boss of. Look up who your congressional representative is. Look up who your state assembly member is. Look up who your state senator is. And look up who your city council is. And call their office, send them emails, tell them what's important to you, ask to meet with them. I am a very accessible elected official. I often set up a table at a farmer's market for 2-3 hours to chat with people and tell them about the budget, tell them what I'm fighting for, what the legislative process is. I love going to schools, talking about civic engagement. I love going to schools and talking to kids because they are whip smart. But it's ensuring that your elected officials are accessible and accountable to you. So know who they are, communicate with them. If there's particular issues you care deeply about, there's lobbying and advocacy days up at the state capitals. It may be hard to get to Albany on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday that we're up there, but you could still, again, write in support of certain bills, in support of certain issues, or against certain issues as well. And while not every representative might take your position, what's important is that your voice is being heard and listened to and taken into account. I have a particular set of values that I run by and fight for. And certainly within my district, you have diversity of opinion, and not everyone agrees with everything I believe in and fight for. But I'm always willing to explain why I care about an issue and why I support an issue or not. And then, like I mentioned over and over again today, it is often about compromise. And as much as, again, we really, really fought for the full good cause eviction bill, we got a watered-down version, but it is a step forward, and explaining kind of what that looks like and how it impacts our community is really important. So communication's key, stepping up is key, and raising your voice is key.
Thank you. Those are all good reminders. So as we are closing out our conversation here today, looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
Young people. I mentioned I love going to schools. They are some of the brightest young people and thoughtful. I've gone to soapbox speech where a third grader gets up and talks about issues that they care about, whether it's the litter in their park or a better school, a gymnasium, or safety in their community. And they do their little pitches. And I take notes. I listen to them. And I feel really hopeful that they're learning about issues, they're learning about how to get involved, and they're speaking up. Public speaking is very scary, and to see a third grader get up in front of their entire class and elected officials to state their position on an issue is very promising. And in terms of climate advocacy, I've seen that really galvanize our young people because they understand viscerally that not taking action on climate is going to impact them, their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. I always think about the next 7 generations, that actions that we take today will impact, and those young people know it. So just a few weeks ago, I had 40 young people from Townsend Harris High School and a group in my district called the Veggie Nuggets, young people who care about climate and climate activism, come to Albany, advocate for things they care about, and really speak out in support of climate justice issues. So it gives me a lot of hope to see our young people step up and take action and approach us. And again, understand that they're our boss. They actually understand that. So it's really exciting. It gives me a lot of hope in terms of democracy.
That's great. Thank you very much for joining me on Future Hindsight. It was really a pleasure to have you back on the show.
Thank you so much, Mila.
Jessica Gonzalez Rojas is the New York State Assembly member representing the 34th District in New York City. Next week on Future Hindsight, we're joined by Madiba Denny. She's an attorney, columnist, and professor whose work focuses on fostering an equitable multiracial democracy. We'll be discussing her new book, The Originalism Trap: How Extremists Stole the Constitution and How We the People Can Take It Back.
I think the most foundational point would be that the Constitution includes everyone, all of the country's residents, and so our constitutional interpretation should work in a way that makes inclusive democracy real. That is not the case right now, nor has that really ever been the case. The Constitution's provisions have never really been actualized in a way that works for everyone. And I think that is a mistake, both morally, but also legally, if you look at the text of the Constitution itself. The whole point of the Reconstruction Amendments was to foster this kind of multiracial democracy for the first time.
That's next time on Future Hindsight. And before I go, first of all, thanks so much for listening. If you like this episode, you'll love what we have in store. Be sure to hit that follow button on Apple Podcasts or the subscribe button on your favorite podcast app so you'll catch all of our upcoming episodes. Thank you. Oh, and please leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. It seems like a small thing, but it can make a huge difference for an independent show like ours. It's the main way other people can find out about the show. We really appreciate your help. Thank you. This episode was produced by Zach Travis and me. Until next time, stay engaged.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.